Okay.
Thanks for that, Greg. And it's good to be here and speak with you all. Obviously we interact with you all in the Central Maryland Chamber often, and certainly I'd be remiss if I didn't say thank you to you all, whether or not some of you probably do, but or not. But Central Maryland Chamber participates, as part of the Maryland Chambers Federation, which is really the bulk of what makes up a lot of the business community's grassroots advocacy efforts during the legislative session. So, to be honest with you, if it wasn't for your all's participation with us when we put out those calls to action, or when we send emails to get the word out on issues, we wouldn't be able to be as successful as we are. So I'll kind of just start by saying, thanks to you all for participating with us. So, like Greg said, I'm Andrew Griffin. I head up the advocacy work here at the Maryland Chamber. Most of you know, but just the Maryland Chamber, it's the largest business advocacy organization in the state, 6,800 plus members. And we work on issues that impact businesses from our state's largest employers to the state's smallest employers. So I always say everything from Lockheed Martin, the state's largest company, all the way down to the single person dry cleaner across the street from us here on West Street, which puts us, it makes our job difficult because, the legislation that gets introduced during a legislative session can impact a small business much different than it can impact a larger or medium-sized. We are always trying to walk that tightrope and that middle ground of trying to take positions and advocate for what is best overall for Maryland's business community, and what is going to make us a more attractive and a more competitive environment. So Hannah and I today I'll talk about some specific bills. I don't expect you to memorize bill numbers or anything like that, but I'm going to talk about things in themes, and Hannah will pretty much do the same. But if you have questions, please don't be shy, write them in the chat or let us know. So I'll kind of dive in. I want to talk about heading into session, kind of lay the groundwork for what we were expecting. So going into the legislative session this year to start January, there was a lot of focus at the end of the year on the budget and on what was essentially an anticipated budget shortfall. And so that the budget numbers are still very much a problem, and a lot of it has to do with revenue, right? It's tax revenue. Maryland is unique in our economy in that most of the country has really rebounded from the COVID-19 pandemic. Our economy, while it continues to grow, but it is growing at a very slow and you could almost say anemic pace. And we have really struggled with getting people who left the workforce from COVID, particularly women, particularly people in certain industries, to return back to the workforce. And in fact, we've lagged the country in returning workforce. And so our economy is really unique, is uniquely challenging here. And because of that, it's led the state to collect less tax revenue than what they had anticipated, right? So we have had multiple budget write-downs, and so we went into the legislative session knowing that multiple revenue write-downs, excuse me, knowing there was going to be some focus on revenue raising, and that's typically in the form of what we call taxes, right? Taxes, fees, kind of the different words for the same thing, but so that we spent a lot of time gearing up and preparing for that. And as expected, we saw a host of tax proposals this year looking to raise revenue and close that funding gap for the state budget. And so there are really two areas of funding priorities I think that's important. One is the state's operating budget, and that's the money that the state uses, right, to run government service. And so we were not collecting as much revenue as typically expected. And so we saw a lot of proposals to raise business taxes. I think the two that I will flag for you, one was called the Fair Share Funding Act of 2024. And that was a package of bills, a package of proposals aimed at what we would call like novel business tax increases. And so implementing things that are kind of outside the bounds of how businesses are used to paying taxes, and instituting things like what's called a throwback rule, which disproportionately impacts manufacturers, or eliminating a carried interest deduction, which particularly impacts like wealth management firms. Think like your Northwestern Mutual, Lake Mason, T. Rowe Price type places. And so we saw this kind of package of tax proposals put together. And to the advocates of that tax package, they were really loud and very passionate about for the legislature to pass this proposal, in saying that businesses are simply not paying their fair share to the state's overall revenues. And so I spent the bulk of this session trying to tell the story of how the budget is actually made up, how much in tax revenue businesses actually pay, and why some of these tax proposals really were not right for Maryland and our economy. We were successful in that, and all of the tax proposals that were kind of wrapped up in the fair share bill did fail this year. So that's good for this year. I think this, along with some of the others that I'll discuss, are going to be items we're going to see continuously come back. And so, not to ever be the bearer of bad news per se, but listen, in future years, the 2025 session and the 2026 session, there's going to be a very real discussion, a very real push for what will be new and additional tax increases on the business community. Is obviously the perspective I'm talking from, but also on the personal side of things. So that's really important. The second bill on the tax front, I will just flag for you all, and many of you likely saw this, as House Bill 1515, and this was an expansion of the state's sales tax to services. And so, as you guys know, mostly if you work in the service industry, Maryland does not collect sales tax on remitted services. Now we do collect sales tax on very, very few services. It is just less than a handful of professional services that we do collect sales tax on. But by and large, we do not extend sales tax to things like legal services or accounting services, or when you go and you get a car wash. Those types of things are not taxed at the sales tax level. And so there was a large proposal put in to expand it to all services. And so there's been a lot of interest in this proposal from the legislature for a number of years. This is not new. I mean, this goes back 10, 15 years that this has kind of been kicked around. This proposal is always really popular because it has a very large price tag attached to it, a very large tax revenue tag for the state attached to it. Most of that money that generates such a large price tag comes from business to business services. And so that's so very important for us as the business community, because all of the services, particularly the small business community, right? If I'm a small business, I don't have the ability to have my accounting in-house, or my legal services are probably not in-house, and my IT services are probably not in-house. I contract out with individual companies to do all that work. And so I'm then getting slapped with sales tax on every single one of those services I'm using to keep my business up and running. And certainly the person I'm getting those services from, they're just passing on that tax to you. You're likely internalizing that by raising the cost of whatever your product or service is, which is then ultimately just ends up in this feedback loop of increasing cost of goods, increasing cost of services, and the overall cost of doing business in the state. And so it is something that impacts all businesses, but is particularly impactful on small businesses, as they tend to acquire more services than larger businesses. So that bill came in very late. Again, we were given a really short turnaround to kind of generate some opposition. We did a pretty good job, and again, thank you to you all for helping to generate opposition to that. That bill did not go anywhere; it died. but I think that it's one that we will see come back, not one that's going to come back the way it likely was packaged in extending it to all services. But I would not be surprised to see something come back with limiting services. And so say, hey, we would extend sales tax to accounting services and real estate services, something like that. And they, mechanics or auto mechanics, things like that, as opposed to going after everything. So, um, and then kind of last, and I won't get too much in the details, but as far as revenues go, the other major discussion being around the Transportation Trust Fund. And many of you have heard, we are kind of underwater on our state's Transportation Trust Fund and the amount of money that we have to fund paving of roads, building of new bridges, maintenance of those types of things. So there's been a big push. There's an independent commission looking at new and innovative ways of funding transportation in the state. They did pass some new, mostly fee increases, but a new fee on electric services, or excuse me, on electric vehicle owners, since they're not contributing to the gas tax, to kind of, you're getting contributions there, and creating new weight classifications for vehicle registration. There was a host of those types of items looking at really funding the TTF, but won't spend a ton of time on that. Just know that that is kind of that's kind of like a third rail of the funding discussion outside of the operating budget, capital budget. This transportation need is kind of out there, and we're going to see items like, your car registrations and things are likely going to go up as a result. So just keep an eye out for that. All right, I'm just going to kind of roll in a couple more things I want to flag for you. I think one, impacting all businesses is on the unemployment insurance side. So for the, I think, third year in a row, we saw a major proposal to kind of overhaul the state's unemployment insurance system, really spearheaded by a delegate in the House who serves on economic matters, named Delegate Charkoudian. She represents Tacoma Park, Montgomery County. And she continues to put in this large omnibus bill to overhaul the state's UI system. There are a lot of proposals and a lot of things in that bill. But I think the most important thing to understand is that the bill will increase all employers' unemployment insurance tax. And so we've done a really good job of fending it off for the last handful of years. I think next year, there will be a reckoning. We will see some changes to the unemployment insurance system. Will it be all the things that are proposed in this bill? Likely not. But finding a middle ground somewhere in the middle will likely lead to an increase in what employers are paying for UI tax. Which, remember, unemployment insurance system is totally funded by employers. Employees do not contribute to it. And so it is solely coming off the backs of businesses. Again, businesses of all sizes pay that. On the one small kind of win on the UI front, certainly for those of you who maybe work in like retail or the restaurant industry, have a lot of experience with this. We've continued to hear complaints from businesses about what's called the ghosting effect, using my air quotes, ghosting. But we tend to see this problem in certain industries over others, where let's say you have an open position and you receive tons of applications for an open position, and you go through and you pick up the phone, you call somebody to come in for an interview, and you call 15 applicants and nobody responds or ever gets back to you, and that person maybe likely just submitted an application in order to continue to stay eligible for the state's unemployment insurance system. That is part of the actively seeking work search requirements to continue to receive UI benefits. And so, working alongside some of the other business trade associations, we passed a bill directing the Department of Labor to do a comprehensive study of other states actively seeking work search requirements, and comparing them to ours, to look at ways to make sure that we are being as I'm not going to say stringent, but that we are trying to strike a fair middle ground between making sure it is not too onerous for people who are on unemployment insurance to be able to receive that benefit, but also, right, we want to be incentivizing them to get back into the workforce as quickly as possible. And so we don't want those requirements to be so easy that they're not really actively trying to get back into another job. And they're just simply, hitting the apply now button on a bunch of Indeed applications and leaving the employer to sift through hundreds of applications to find just one that may be a serious applicant. And so that is kind of one good win there on the unemployment insurance front. So hopefully more to come from that. And then kind of the last two items I'll hit kind of continue to fall under the Department of Labor umbrella. Is one is on the family program, family and medical leave insurance. This is a big program for the business community. We have talked about it ad nauseum for the last however many years. And so the Department of Labor brought forth a bill to make necessary corrections, to help ease the administrative burden for them on this program. Of note is that this bill will delay the implementation of this program so that employees and employers will not have to make contributions into the program now until July 1 of 2025. And then benefits can begin to be drawn July 1 of 2026. So that's the big change, right? So just as a refresher for everybody, the state passed a big paid family and medical leave insurance mandate that all employees in the state are going to have to participate in. The contributions of that, it is basically going to be funded on a payroll tax, a payroll deduction coming from the employee, 50% coming from the employees, 50% coming from an employer. Employers with less than 15 employees do not have to contribute. Those with 15 or more will be required to contribute half of that contribution amount. And it's up to 12 weeks that someone can take off from work for a very long list of reasons, and receive a benefit from the state. The state is the administrator of the program, so you as the employer, will not be able to say yes you can or cannot take it, or here's when you can take it. That is completely up to the state, and the employer will be expected to hold that position for the individual until they return. So it's a very large and onerous program. The Department of Labor is currently working through the regulatory process and trying to prop up the program as best they can. Maryland's program is the most employee friendly in the country, and so it is going to be really difficult for businesses to administer and to work around. So, but for the most part, the bill that the Department of Labor had this year was a lot of technical corrections and a lot of technical fixes. Again, but just reiterating, the big change being a delay in the contributions and a delay when benefits can be drawn by a year. And then the last item I'll hit, kind of in the Department of Labor bucket, is the legislature did pass a wage range transparency law this past year. So many of you have likely seen, if you scroll through LinkedIn and job postings, you see jobs in other states. Let's take like a Colorado or a Washington. They're required by law to post a wage range for that position in that area. So Maryland passed a law very similar to this. So businesses of all sizes, when they post for jobs, are going to be required to post some kind of a wage range. We did a lot of work on this bill and got a lot of amendments on this bill. To be honest, this is probably one of the most employer-friendly wage range laws in the country. And so it is very broad, it is very loosey-goosey, so it should give businesses as much leeway as possible to make this happen. And so, if you screw up once, you're not going to get sued, you're not getting taken to court. It's pretty, if you screw up 100 times, you're still not getting taken to court. So it's very employer friendly. So there will be some new requirements that you will have to comply with as of October 1, which certainly your HR folks or whomever you contract with HR will be able to help you through that to make sure that all your job postings moving forward are in compliance. But the burden is fairly low. So those are super highlights from my end. I'm happy to take questions, or I can just let Hannah go. Whatever works, Greg.
Yeah, I think have Hannah go and we can have some time for question and answers at the end.
Sure.
Perfect. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me on today. Happy to be here. Happy to go over some updates from my end with you all. As mentioned at the top of the call, my name is Hannah. Work with Andrew on the government affairs team here at the Chamber. And, you know, like Andrew mentioned, I think that we had a successful session for business this session, which is good, right? Because there was a lot of focus on new taxes, on revenue raisers, bigger ones coming from businesses. There were about, I think, 2,800 bills introduced this year that we went through and were involved in. So I'll touch on some issue areas that Andrew did not cover that I think are important for businesses to know about. Some of these did not go anywhere this session, but are likely to come back, and some of them did pass. So I just want to start on the healthcare front. So we saw legislation introduced aimed at expanding the Prescription Drug Affordability Board's authority to the private market. So just for some quick background, Maryland was the first state to pass and establish a Prescription Drug Affordability Board, or called PDAB. This bill establishing PDAB passed in 2019. Governor Hogan vetoed it, and then the legislature overrode it during the 2020 session. So the board is essentially tasked with finding ways to lower the costs of medication for employees that are on the state's healthcare plan, so state employees. I'll say PDAB's work has been slow since they have kind of got up and running on their feet with funding, but they've recently selected 8 medications to look into for possible caps. So the bill we saw that was introduced this session would have expanded the board's authority to the private sector, so applying it to all residents and not just state employees. So this would allow the board to set upper payment limits on certain prescription drug purchases for anybody. We oppose that bill due to the concern of allowing for government-imposed upper payment limits as a way for the government to price set. You know, there's definitely big concern that this could have a chilling effect on the market. It could slow down innovation and make it harder really for the state to attract new investments in businesses here. So I think if you're a drug manufacturing company, a life sciences company, this could really impact your ability to secure capital and funding for research and development. I think that our concern was echoed by a lot of stakeholders during the bill's hearing process. Many said that the government shouldn't interfere with the private market through price controls on privately produced products. So I think, you know, another big issue for this bill is that the board simply hasn't completed a bulk of its work yet. It's too soon to expand the authority of PDAB until their initial work is complete. So I think we can certainly expect the bill to come back, especially after the board is finished with kind of their initial work that they were tasked with. And really, I'm flagging this too, because we're seeing a broader focus from the federal government looking for more authority to step into the private market and for example, seize patents when they feel prices are too high. And this expands beyond drug prices, right? And pharmaceuticals. So I just want to flag that as kind of an emerging focus in the healthcare and drug manufacturing and pricing space that I think will kind of grow bigger as the years move on and future sessions come. I also want to flag a bill that did pass. So we have increasingly heard from small businesses about how in Maryland they cannot participate in a PEO, or what's called a professional employer organization. So for those unfamiliar with PEOs, they essentially offer a suite of services. So they can offer HR, they can offer payroll, healthcare, workers' comp. They're pretty much like an administrative partner arm to businesses. And Maryland is unique in not allowing PEOs to offer aggregated healthcare plans to their clients. So 47 states and DC allow it, but Maryland, and I think it's Alaska and Maine, do not. So this year, there was a study bill that passed that we supported requiring the Maryland Insurance Administration to study the impacts regulating PEOs could have on the small group market in Maryland, and really to look at what other states have done. Since this is a widely used practice in other states. That study is due by, I think, December 31st of this year. So I think that we'll probably see some legislation introduced next year or the following year. pushing to allow PEOs to offer aggregated healthcare plans to employers, to small employers. And I think this is important because, this really allows more flexibility in offering health coverage. It makes businesses more attractive because they can offer really competitive healthcare packages to employees. And you're thinking about larger businesses that have the ability to do that. This kind of gives an upper hand to small businesses to give them more leeway in what they can offer. So that's something we're going to be keeping an eye on. Certainly looking forward to reading the study and seeing what it says. All right, I'm going to jump into climate and energy and environmental related legislation, which, I feel like every year we see a lot of that. So the Maryland Department of the Environment released their climate pollution reduction plan a week or two before session started, right after Christmas. And it outlined a bunch of recommendations and suggestions that the legislature and the administration could take to meet our climate goals, our greenhouse gas reduction goals. There were a handful of bills introduced this session that were pulled directly from that report. I'll say, I think many of them were introduced knowing that they were unlikely to pass or go anywhere this year, as it's the first year we've seen some of them and their new ideas. But they were definitely conversation starters, I think, and something that we expect to see again and come back in the 2025 session. I'll quickly highlight some of them. So we saw a hazardous substance fee bill for transporting coal and natural gas. I think this was House Bill 1008. This included railway transport and also natural gas entering Maryland through pipelines. The natural gas through pipelines piece was amended and added into the bill after it was introduced, which definitely created a lot more concern as the cost on transporting natural gas will ultimately be passed down to ratepayers, resulting in energy and gas prices to go up. So that bill was not voted on and it didn't move this year. I think the sponsor, Delegate Stein, is unclear yet if that's something he will bring back next year, but I think that's something that I'm expecting to come back. There was also a cap and invest program introduced, which would essentially create a statewide carbon tax. That bill did not pass or really get much momentum this session. Again, this is the first time we've seen it. Maryland participates in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is it's a mix of 11 states kind of surrounding and in our area that participates in a cap and invest program. But this would pretty much put one in place only for the state of Maryland. We've seen a few other states at this point either looking at it or trying to implement it, like California. So again, something I think we'll see come back. Last one I want to flag is the Better Buildings Act. This bill was introduced this session for the first time. It would essentially mandate that any new construction in Maryland needs to meet electric ready standards. So a lot of those concerns, we're thinking of this as essentially a gas ban in new buildings. So that bill certainly was concerning to us and to a lot of stakeholders. And that's something that we're keeping an eye on to come back next session as well. But again, most of the bigger energy and environmental bills did not pass. I do think we'll continue to see pressure to pass new measures really aimed at getting the revenue that the state needs to pay for our climate goals and our greenhouse gas reduction goals, which is going to be in the billions of dollars. I do want to highlight, kind of getting into the weeds, but I want to highlight kind of a last minute amendment that we saw in the state's budget at the very end of session. So I'll get into that, but I also want to touch on building energy performance standards. So some of you may remember that in the Climate Solutions Now Act, this is the big climate bill that passed in 2022. It required MDE to adopt building energy performance standards, which they're currently working on those regulations right now. So in the regulations, it's essentially saying that large buildings will need to meet certain greenhouse gas emission reduction standards and site energy use intensity standards. The standards, I would say, are very stringent and will require building owners to retrofit buildings or electrify them so they can come into compliance with those standards. They are designed to essentially force buildings to use less energy, right? That's the point of it. So as you can imagine, the cost of complying with the regulations is in the billions. Especially for older buildings, it's very expensive to retrofit. So the big takeaway, circling back to what I mentioned before, is during the conference committee discussions over the state's budget that occurred during the last few weeks of session, there was an amendment added to the budget backed by the speaker that says MDE cannot use funding to adopt or enforce energy use intensity standards in the regulations until they comply with the specific requirements that were outlined in the Climate Solutions Now Act. And I think the main one there is that MDE needs to do benchmarking of buildings throughout the state. So they're using actual data and actual numbers in the regulations. So they know, how to set those standards based on actual numbers and not estimates, which are in the current draft regulations. So that's slated, the benchmarking is slated to take place throughout 2025. So we may see that portion of the regulations delayed until MDE completes that work. They also would need to issue a report assessing really the cost of compliance with these requirements. Again, I know I'm kind of getting into the weeds on this here, but this amendment is helpful to us, so I'm glad it was added. It does not, again, mean the entirety of the regulations themselves are delayed. They can certainly proceed with the other standards in there, but if you own or operate a covered building that's 35,000 square feet or more, you should certainly pay attention to these regulations. And there's a good amount of information on MDE's website if you're interested in looking into it more. All right, I think last kind of energy related item I have is I just want to talk about data centers quickly. So data centers really took up a lot of focus this session alongside, like Andrew mentioned, taxes, revenue raisers for transportation and education funding. So the governor introduced the Critical Infrastructure Streamlining Act. This really exempts backup generators from the definition of a generation station within the state's Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity process, the CPCN process. So this bill doesn't only apply to data centers, it applies to other critical industries and businesses like hospitals, where if they lose power and the grid experiences a blackout, for example, they need to ensure that they have a reliable backup power source to keep people alive or to safeguard sensitive information and data. So, I think this issue really started where a large data center project in Frederick was denied their request for a CPCN exemption because they had diesel backup generators. So they ended up pulling out of the project, and that's a big investment that we had worked really hard to attract to Maryland that easily left due to that. The governor's focus continues to be on making Maryland more competitive, and this bill is aimed at removing barriers to growth in our tech sector and in other sectors. It's streamlining the regulatory process for those industries that rely on backup power. And so in emergency situations, they can use diesel powered backup generation. I just think it makes sense. Baltimore was recently named a federal tech hub, right? Which makes us eligible, or Baltimore City eligible, for hundreds of millions of dollars in funding from the federal government. And like I mentioned, at least from the chamber's end, and I know from many other stakeholders in the administration's end, we've worked for years to attract new industries to Maryland, like technology and data centers. So I think this bill really builds on the momentum that the state has put forward. I'll say the only caveat: environmentalists did not like the legislation over concern that it's working against the state's climate goals by allowing diesel powered backup generation in the mix. There was an amendment added to kind of help alleviate their concerns. So they'll take 15% of the state corporate income tax that these facility owners pay and put it into the state's Strategic Energy Investment Fund, which is really used to fund climate projects. So the bill did pass. It was one we definitely supported. So we're glad to see that move along. All right. I want to talk about two other bills. So as we saw last year, I think there has been a continued push from the new Attorney General for expanded authority. There were a handful of bills from the Attorney General's office this year and last year that we engaged on that would have impacted businesses. I'll say most of them that we were concerned about did not pass. But I do want to touch on a bill that did pass, which was not an Attorney General bill, but it has to do with liability agreements that recreational facilities have customers sign. So many businesses require a customer to sign a waiver to reduce their liability, which I think is really important, especially for small businesses and their operations, and can even be required by businesses' insurers. So Senate Bill 452 essentially prohibits commercial recreational facilities from including any provision or clause in their waivers or agreements that has to do with gross negligence liability. So the bill really intends to focus on injuries that happen because of a business's negligence. But I think there's certainly going to be more claims and litigation because of this bill, and premiums for commercial liability insurance will probably go up. This really impacts a ton of small businesses. Think horseback riding, water sports, golf courses, axe throwing, you know, I think the list goes on and on and on. The only exemptions are for hotels that operate a recreational facility within them. So, you know, I think the issue here is delineating the gross negligence liability, right? If somebody, for example, stands up to do a backflip off of a jet ski, but the throttle was sticky because the owner didn't check or repair a throttle, the customer injured can say that's why they were injured, because the employer failed to ensure the jet ski was 100% safe and everything was working properly, not because they did a flip off of a moving jet ski. So it all really comes down to the he said, she said. So that bill is going to the governor's desk. I think it's important to flag. I'm sure the Central Maryland Chamber has a lot of businesses operating, you know, recreational facilities. So one more bill I want to touch on that we've seen introduced for the past few years would remove the current cap, or the way it was introduced, it would remove the cap on non-economic damages in civil actions for personal injury and wrongful death cases. So this bill had not gone anywhere in the past, but this year there was a Senate cross-file to the bill, and the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee passed it. The House did not move on the bill, so it did die, but I think it's important to flag it with you all because it impacts all businesses, right? And can result in increased insurance premiums. So for a little background, Maryland enacted a non-economic damages cap in the 1980s. I think this was at like $350,000 when it was enacted. The cap increases each year by an annual escalator, which is set at $15,000. So the current cap is sitting at about $935,000. So you have your economic damages, which are the direct expenses and costs of an accident. So these are things like lost wages for missing work or your medical bills accrued. And then you have your non-economic damages, which are your intangibles, like your pain and suffering and your physical impairment. So Maryland chose to cap non-economic damages decades ago because pain and suffering it's really hard to quantify. So a reasonable cap was put in place to avoid excessive awards. This year's bill that was introduced was amended in the Senate. So instead of removing the cap altogether, it would nearly double it to 1.75 million, along with increasing the annual escalator to 20,000 a year. So it increased by 20,000 a year. It was interesting. An independent firm did an analysis on this proposal and found that insurance premiums for all types of businesses would increase, I think, by around, it was like 12 or 13 to 18%. And then auto liability, which would have seen an even larger jump, could increase by up to 30%. So, you know, think about your trucking and transportation industry, that they would see a huge impact there. The supporters of this were the plaintiffs' attorneys, and their goal really was for a full removal of the cap. So I think we definitely expect to see this bill come back in some form again. It's something that we will really be paying attention to. So I think it's important to flag that with you all. But that really wraps up what I wanted to go over and flag with this group. The governor, I'll mention the governor tentatively has 3 bill signings. He's already done 1 happening throughout April and May. Bills do need to be signed or vetoed by May 28th. So that's kind of the timeline we're working with on how bills will move moving forward. But Greg, I'll turn it over back to you. Andrew and I are happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah and Andrew. And I just want to thank you both for your time and efforts during the legislative session. I know it's a very busy time of year, and you guys really do a great job to advocate for the business community in the state. So thank you both very much. Now, if anyone has any questions, we'll open it up for question and answers.
I have a couple.
Yeah, go ahead.
My first is in regards to taxing services in other states, just to kind of give us some perspective. Do other states tax services usually?
So some states, well, let's say a lot of states tax some services the way that we already do. So
Okay.
a lot of states will tax a small handful of services, but only, I think it's West Virginia and one other state off the top of my head. I know no one taxes as many services as West Virginia does. One other state may tax a wide range, like North Dakota maybe does like a wide range of services, but no one to the extent of certainly West Virginia. That's the outlier. So some states, most states tax a few small services.
Yeah, and I'll just add some color, I guess, to what Andrew was saying. The 2 or 3 states, it's like Hawaii, New Mexico, I think, in North Dakota or South Dakota. They kind of opted for a blanket tax on services, but then they exempt certain services in there, while pretty much all the other states, I know West Virginia is different, but all the other states just have a very limited list that they may tax. So that's kind of like what we're seeing nationwide.
Yeah,
And
and
then the
Hawaii is
other
very,
question, sorry, go
Hawaii is
ahead.
really interesting on the services because, you know, an argument with services is you can just procure a service somewhere else, in another state that doesn't tax it. Well, you know, Hawaii is completely isolated, so you can't just go get your car worked on in California.
Right.
So they have the ability to tax a wide range of things, and people don't have an option to choose another, which is a really interesting kind of way of going. But
Thanks. And then my other question was in regards to the quality of the roads in Baltimore City. So I know you were talking about that, about finding new sources of revenue for that. It's really tricky in the city.
so it's a highly, so what you're talking about is kind of it is a subset issue of a larger issue, but it's there's some layers to that. So you know, Baltimore City has continued to see its share of highway user funds reduced over the years. There are lots of reasons for that. Also, the city is not completely innocent. The city has chosen to spend its highway user revenues on other things that aren't necessarily fixing the roads. So there's a lot of issues in between that, but yes, at aggregate, at the most macro, the state is seeing a declining return in revenues that are dedicated to transportation funds, and therefore there's less money to get distributed to the localities who primarily maintain the roads. So it's becoming an issue, and I will say, you know, the package pass this year should give an additional annual increase in the transportation trust fund by close to 300 million a year, which is helpful, but it's not nearly where we need to be. I think we're in a shortfall of somewhere 1 to 2 billion for transportation funds. So there's going to be need to be a much more aggressive policy approach. I think what we can expect for those of you who maybe do business or travel in Northern Virginia, you know, Virginia has a really unique model. They have 2 taxing authorities, basically transportation taxation authorities, one for Northern Virginia, one in the Norfolk Newport News area. I think you can expect to see something like that pop up here in Maryland. So if you live in Baltimore City, for example, I think what you can expect to see is a new type of transportation authority that has the independent power to levy taxes on certain transportation items in within the city to increase revenues for city use. Montgomery County, Prince George's County are other jurisdictions that we can kind of expect to see something like that. That's probably my prediction.
Okay,
Particularly areas that have to support mass transit. Maryland is unique. We're the only state in the country that supports 2 mass transit systems, right? The Baltimore and the DC Metro. No other state has 2 mass transit systems that the state attempts to support. So, you know, it's really hard to give money for roads when it's all coming out of the same pot. You know, you have to do metro and roads.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions for Hannah and Andrew? Right, looks like there aren't. So Hannah and Andrew, thank you again for your time today and insights on the legislative session and the impact it had on the business. Oh, wait, Chris, do you have a question?
Not a question, my man, but just a general comment. Thank you folks for the work that you do. We would be in a really scary state if it wasn't for the 2 of you guys. We appreciate you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
And echoing Chris, thank you both for your time today and for your insights. And we're lucky to have you both leading our efforts on the state level. So thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks,
Appreciate you
Greg.
guys.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you.